Hello and welcome back for another question session. My name is Heske, I'm reporting to you live from the Lighthouse, and I'm excited that you're here with us. We're about to beam you over to the constellation of innovation. It's not the first time we're flying out there, because Mariana Mazzucato has already started us off. We had a lot of interesting questions come up there, but now we're going to add to the pile. Bill Lazonick is here with us to give us his input, and we're excited for the questions that you will suggest. Remember that you can actually join us and participate live in the session. If you're watching the stream, go to ysiplenary.org and join us there. If you're new, here's a little video that explains the details of how this works. First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the questions fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find questions fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list. With that introduction, I think you are ready to fly over to the innovation constellation. Let's go!
It's a new innovation. If you invented it, then we'll give you an ovation. Does it further intertwine us while it simplifies payments, as it instantly connects us with the right information? Yeah, but also shares your data sets and tracks your location, so that your next prospective vendor knows you're going and staying. Oh, and it's addictive. There are 17 seasons. You can buy it over the counter, though you don't need a reason. Innovation, it's on. But when's an innovation right and when is it wrong? History decides it as we sidle along, until it blows up like a hoverboard or hydrogen bomb. Who can tell if an invention's made to benefit creation, or if it's in its essence just destructive, inhumane, and not a go? And if it's both, then what's the balance of the gain and of the loss? Feeling lost, are we all? Innovation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again. I'm Cecilia Ducat. As I said before, I'm the outgoing coordinator of the States and Markets Working Group. We are here again in the innovation constellation to keep discussing all together different questions that may be part of the 100 most pertinent questions of our time, which is the final goal of the YSI virtual plenary. Today, and in this talk, we will be hosting Bill Lazonick, and while he speaks, you will all be able to suggest new questions. Remember that these are questions that we invite you to think as relevant questions for our future work, for our future research, for projects that we want to build within and beyond YSI. So these are not questions that we are directly asking Bill Lazonick to answer, but questions that we want to reflect together with him, that we want to work with him, and afterwards, after his talk, we will also try to improve these questions by rephrasing them. So also while Bill Lazonick is speaking, those of you that have been here before already know that you will have the chance to like as many questions as you want to. Likes is just simply clicking on the hearts. So while creating new questions, make sure you read the questions that others are creating, and let's collectively choose which will be the questions that Rosie, the session moderator of this session, will be asking Bill Lazonick shortly. So with no further ado, I will just leave the floor to Rosie to introduce our speaker. And remember to suggest new questions, like them, and we will meet again after the talk.
Hi everyone, thank you. My name is Rosie Collington, and it is a pleasure to introduce Professor William Lazonick, who, as well as being an academic who has spent his career asking new economic questions about the firm, finance, and about the academic study of economics, among many other things, has also more recently been a great colleague and mentor of mine. So William Lazonick is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, and co-founder and president of the Academic Industry Research Network based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is an Open Society Fellow and a Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Fellow. Over the last decade, the Institute for New Economic Thinking has funded a number of his research projects. So as you will shortly find out, his research focuses on the social conditions of innovation and economic development in both advanced and emerging economies. He's been the recipient of numerous prizes throughout his career, including the Ushaped Prize in 2010. And in January of this year, Oxford University Press published his latest book, which was co-authored with Jiang Sup-Shin, Predatory Value Extraction: How the Looting of the Business Corporation Became the US Norm and How Sustainable Prosperity Can be Restored, which I can very much recommend if you enjoy the presentation today. Over to you, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Rosie, and hello to everybody. So here is the question, the big question: is the most unproductive firm the foundation of the most efficient economy? It's obviously an absurd question, but unfortunately, it is a question that has that economists, PhD economists, have been teaching students for well over 7 decades, if not longer. It appeared in a book, textbook that came out in its first edition by Paul Samuelson in 1948, Economics and Introductory Analysis. And what basically is portrayed as the theory of the firm is that the ideal firm is one that's constrained, so it's actually impotent. And because it's so small and unproductive, the market does everything. So the market's omnipotent. And from this point of view, you then see the whole world as this market ideal. Everything becomes a market imperfection. And if you see the world that way, then you basically are making that statement that with which I entitled this talk. And what we actually need is a theory of how we get productivity, how we get higher quality, lower cost products, and firms play a big, big role in that. So we have to get away from teaching people about how we would actually, as I will show you, be living in poverty if we had the textbook theory of the firm. Okay, now, the one person who had a lot of insight into this was Joseph Schumpeter. Now, one thing I can say is that as I was studying economics and even teaching it at Harvard University in the 1970s, I realized that basically what neoclassical economists had done had just dismissed all the good ideas that have been left behind. So it's not even a matter of new economic questions. Go back to the history of thought and resurrect the old questions. And one of the questions that Schumpeter asked is, why do economists have this notion that perfect competition is an ideal? So in Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, which came out in 1942, he basically says, as in this quote, that large firms are driving the growth of the economy. And in this respect, perfect competition is not only impossible, but inferior, and in no title to being set up as a model of ideal efficiency, which basically is consistent with the basically critique I'm making of that question of this session. Now, someone who found some of the answers to this, and if you haven't read her, you should, was Edith Penrose's Theory of the Growth of the Firm, who is a classic book. As I often say, it's a classic of book that everybody cites, but a few have read. But basically what Edith Penrose argues is that the growth of the firm involves investment in people, investment in organization. And that when you invest in organization, basically you turn people into a fixed cost. You are making investment in organizational learning, or what I call collective and cumulative learning, and that drives the growth of the firm. Now, I'll take that further in a minute. Penrose, at the beginning of her book, she does, however, make a mistake, I would say an intellectual mistake or a debating mistake, because she said, let other people have that theory of the firm that's in the textbooks of optimizing a maximum marginal revenues at marginal cost, the upward sloping supply curve. I have a different theory. I'll tend my garden. They should tend there. No, if you take Penrose seriously, as I'll show you, you totally destroy their garden. You nuke it. Now, she also had some differences with Marx, and I have differences with Marx, early work I did in my career, where Marx thought labor was just reduced to a total commodity. But even in the 19th century, employers depended on the skills, the capabilities, the incentives of workers, and labor is never a commodity in a successful firm. Now, 100 years later, Penrose looked at business corporations that were dominating the US and global economy in the 1950s, and she saw they were huge organizations with hundreds of thousands of people, in which not only did you have people on the shop floor, but you had all kinds of scientists, engineers, research labs, et cetera. And she said, hey, this is a different type of beast. Now, someone who corroborated the research of Edith Penrose, and someone who I worked quite closely in the 1980s, the business historian Alfred Chandler, showed that the essence of this was not only that you invested in people, but that it was managers who were employees on salaries, basically, who were building these firms that were dominating in the U.S. economy and in many ways globally. And again, now, what I have extracted from this work of Schumpeter, Penrose, Chandler, many other things, and by a lot of study of what's actually gone on historically, is that we have to see innovation as a uncertain, collective, and cumulative process. And won't spend much time on that other than to say, because it's uncertain, collective, and cumulative, when we study the firm, we need to understand who exercises strategic control. What are their abilities and incentives? How do they integrate people into learning processes? And how is this sustained over time, for which you need what I call financial commitment? Okay, now, I have a paper, which is on the INET website, which is the basis in many ways of this talk, where you see that there's a big difference between this notion of the firm, what I call Penrosian learning, labor becomes a fixed factor engaged in collective and cumulative learning, and the textbook theory of the firm, where initially labor was, by Samuelson, was seen as a variable factor. You just add one more unit of labor, one less unit of labor as you want to maximize profit. Now, Samuelson, who I call the liberal mythologizer of the market economy, he had this notion of the grand neoclassical synthesis. He saw that his main intellectual contribution was marginal cost equals marginal revenue or marginal analysis. In his 388 scientific papers, almost no empirical data whatsoever. But he had a big impact with his textbook. Now, I originally took a course a long time ago in using the 5th edition. You'll see why this is important. It was actually the 1961 edition. And I think I questioned things then. At least somehow they were not able to miseducate me into believe this nonsense, which most people, in fact, are arguing. Now, what I learned in that textbook, first on page 24, was that about the famous law of diminishing returns, upward sloping, the U-shaped cost curve, upward sloping supply curve, diminishing return, a fundamental law of economics. Then it said, oh yes, but there could be economies of scale, mass production. In fact, Samuelson himself says lots of the products we buy, this is 1948 originally he wrote this, are from produced by large firms, but this he called a digression. Now, from my perspective, that means that these people are digressions. And they're never mentioned in all the 18 editions of Samuelson. So somehow ideas and reality is being ignored. Here's what, of course, people reflexively will just put down as supply and demand. We do not want upward sloping supply curves in our economy. We want economies of scale. If we had upward sloping supply curves, we would be living in poverty. Okay, now where does this come from? You go into Samuelson's textbook, and buried away, it starts in the first edition, but in the fifth edition on page 524, as an explanation for why you have the U-shaped cost curve, which everybody is familiar with. And what he says, that's really the smoking gun, which really gives his definition of why the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. He says, as average variable cost begins to rise because of limitations of plant space and management difficulties, remember those things, average cost finally begins to turn up. And I say finally, I emphasize that because if it doesn't turn up, then this whole intellectual venture of that you can equate at the margin, that you can just maximize profit subject to constraints, and the firm is not shaping the economy, but just responding to consumer demand, that all falls apart. Now, basically, what he is arguing is that, okay, you get, and what's in the textbooks is you get decreasing costs because you're spreading out fixed costs. Now, in the Penrosian world, it's also not just plant and equipment, but even more importantly, the fixed costs of building an organization. But at some point, the rise in variable costs overwhelms the decline in fixed costs. And in fact, it overwhelms it to such an extent that you get this U-shaped cost curve. Now, take it one step further. The sooner it does this relative to the size of the industry, the more quickly, the smaller level of output relative to the size of the industry, you get that U-shaped cost curve. You get variable costs overwhelming the decline in fixed costs, then the more firms there are in the industry, and you call that perfect competition, and you say, hey, the firm is a price taker, that's the most efficient economy. Okay, now, basically what is being argued about, because Samuelson does argue, in fact, or what was being argued at the time and is implicit in this argument of limitation of plant-based management difficulties, is that the workplace becomes more crowded, people bump into each other, they become less productive, they're getting the same wage, or they're discontent, they start screwing around with the machines, or they fall asleep, or they're just out of sight and just playing around rather than being productive. And that really is the foundation of neoclassical economics coming out of Samuelson, low or no productivity workers. Okay, now basically what you then have is the firm as a sweatshop. And basically what he is saying, the limitations of plant space, workers crowd together, become less productive, more and more workers as you expand output. Management can't control workers because workers hate to work, and you get this rising variable costs. Okay, now you won't find this explanation in the current textbooks because they just give the numerical example and call it the law of diminishing returns, and then go along their merry way to talk about the law of diminishing returns. Now, what Samuelson did is somewhere between 1961 and 64, he realizes the absurdity of the neoclassical theory of the firm, the notion that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. And so he said, well, maybe I better take that out of my book. So what he did is he just eliminated the explanation. It's not there or in subsequent editions. And he doesn't come back to the alternative, which he recognized of what if we have economies of scale? What if growth of a large firm, as Schumpeter says, are really fundamental to the productivity of our economy? Now, some people might just say, as you might be, wait a minute, what about the proof of the superiority of perfect competition in a monopoly model that's in every textbook? Okay, the problem here is that this is a totally illogical argument because it's assumed that when you have one firm in industry facing the actual industry demand curve, downward sloping, that it's facing the same cost structure as perfect competition. Well, then how do the monopolists become a monopolist? Here is the logical comparison, and I put Samuelson there as the illogical one and Penrose there as the logical one. Basically, this is what Penrose and Schumpeter were arguing and what I've developed in a lot of work I've done as a theory of the innovative firm that blows the optimizing firm out of the water. As I say at the bottom, guess who who got the Swedish Central Bank Prize in Economics? It wasn't Penrose. Okay, and so you have this very different theory of the firm, and in the one way of looking at it, I'll go very, very quickly, is basically you can just show how someone makes an investment, the dotted line, they think that they're going to get economies of scale. A time period goes by. In fact, that doesn't happen. What happens is there is something, maybe material that is in short supply. They can't expand output. They get increasing costs. But rather than taking that as the end point and saying, oh, we're at a competitive disadvantage relative to the optimizing firm, they said, oh, we have to integrate the problem of the input that we're buying from the market. And so you incur more fixed costs to do that integration, which involves learning. And maybe after 100 iterations of this, you might be successful, maybe you won't. Okay, but what then is required basically is going back to strategy, organization, and finance, basically to shape that cost curve. Now, the other side of it, go through this very quickly, you have demand curves, and I kind of see in advanced economies that have often with government spending a lot of money on research and development, you end up moving along supply curves, a segmented or demand curves from high income price insensitive to low income price sensitive. In the Asian economies, often borrowing or transferring technology from abroad, let's say the Japanese in cars, you start at the low end and move toward the high end. So you can develop a whole theory of firm supply and demand using this theory of innovative enterprise. When you have innovative enterprise, you it's not zero sum. You can share out the gains. The question is how you share out the gains. A lot of my work on corporate governance is about that. Okay, now, very quickly, 9 assumptions of perfect competition. Each one becomes more and more absurd. Okay, that the firm is constrained because of overcrowding, the workplace, loss of control. Samuelson's original argument. That's possible, but then you got a big problem. Assume that it outweighs average variable cost, the rise outweighs decline in average fixed cost. That's possible too, but that's a stretch. Assume that every entrepreneur just optimizes such constraints, doesn't try to change them, and assume that all firms try to optimize subject to these concerns and doesn't try to change them. Finally, you'll have 4 more assumptions, and I'll get to the all-important 9th one. Then you say, okay, now call this perfect competition because the firm can sell all it wants at a given price. Who cares? It's totally inconsequential. Assume that the proof of perfect competition is this monopoly model that I just showed you. Well, how the monopolists become a monopolist. Assume from the illogical monopoly model that a state of imperfect competition represents a deviation from perfect competition that reduces economic efficiency. Well, this is really becoming nonsense. And assume that the large-scale industrial enterprise, which has employed people, paid higher wages, often driven the growth of the economy, doesn't always do it, is not doing it a lot of it now, is just a market imperfection. Okay, so what's the important 9th assumption? If you accept all these assumptions and you say, okay, that's fine, assume that you are a well-trained economist. Now, I'm going to end in just 1 minute, but there is another guy here, and I'm not going to go through this just as a matter of time, or I'll go through it extremely quickly. The counterpart to Samuelson was Milton Friedman, as you know, the conservative mythologizer of the market economy. And it's the 50th anniversary of an article, a very influential article he wrote, which was a call for that companies should only pursue profits, should not pursue social responsibility. And this led to the shareholder value movement, which I've been critiquing for the last 40 years. It happens I entered the Harvard PhD program in September 1970, the same time that Milton Friedman wrote this article. Now, the context is important. You just can't take economic theory out of context. He made this in response to a proposal made to the General Motors company to put 3 public interest people on the board of directors the previous May, that is in 1970, to advocate for fuel-efficient and safer cars. That was overwhelmingly defeated, and then they just said, well, let's have a study group of these existing directors to look into this. And basically, Friedman called this pure and unadulterated socialism, that companies that would even look into this kind of thing were unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society. Now, we know that actually what happened to the automobile industry and even to General Motors since then. Basically, producing safer cars, more fuel-efficient cars was innovation in the auto industry. That's what you needed to have, uncertain, collective, and cumulative learning, and other companies did it and not General Motors. So what our genius Milton Friedman was telling the executives is don't innovate. And of course, he held the same theory of the firm that Samuelson held. And then if you look at what happened to General Motors since then, you see that they should have put those people on the board of directors. And more recently, Matt Hopkins and I had an article, it was about 5 years ago, in Harvard Business Review, subsequent to 5 years out or 6 years out after the government bailed out General Motors, in which General Motors basically got into trouble. And one of the things that got into trouble is just started trying to prop up its stock price in the 1980s and 1990s rather than invest in innovation in the automobile industry. And in 2015, a guy named Harry J. Wilson showed up at the office of the CEO of GM, Mary Barra, said, we want, for my hedge funds and me, we want you to do $8 billion in stock buybacks, put me on the board. Turned out that Harry J. Wilson was on the Obama task force and structured the way in which the bailout was done. So it was done in a stock rather than when it should have been done in debt. In the end, we, the taxpayer, lost about $11 billion when we sold our stock. The United Auto Workers took a huge hit. The hedge funds, private capital, paid nothing, did nothing to do anything about the bailout, yet this guy shows up once GM starts making a profit and said, that's money is ours, and that gets to the book that Rosie mentioned on predatory value extraction that I've written. So to end, get rid of Friedman and Samuelson. They did huge damage to economics. They put aside all the old economic thinking that was good and kept us from looking at new economic thinking. Get rid of those textbooks. I'm not into book burning, but maybe you should. And most importantly, think organizations, not markets. Go back and study what's relevant in the history of economic thought, study history, and get some new economic ideas. Thanks.
Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was brilliant, really interesting. I'm sure the audience thought so as well. We have a few really exciting questions coming in. So again, Bill, your role in this is to comment on the questions and help us develop them as questions that we can use to think about the economy going forward in the future. So first of all, the question I'm going to ask, I'm not sure who it's from, is how can we explain the mismatch between strong digital innovations and sluggish growth? Okay.
Do you want me to answer these as they come in? Just briefly?
Yeah, so not necessarily answer them, actually. So that's a great question. I can refer you to a book. Yeah, that's great.
that I wrote published in 2009 called Sustainable Prosperity in the New Economy, ? Business Organization and High-Tech Employment in the United States. And it's basically, we have a business model that was developed in the United States, which I call the New Economy business model, where you use the stock market to attract people from secure employment. At other companies in the 80s, you used the stock market to attract venture capital to develop the digital economy. But basically, what most of these firms have done is build on a platform that we gave them. Often the government spending, decades of government spending, or spending in the old corporate research labs where you had scientists employed on salaries, not using stock in order to engage in this collective and cumulative learning. So you get these firms like Apple and a whole lot of others. They've done a lot of innovation, but they're building on platforms that others created, and we get nothing back. And not only we get nothing back, they go to the extreme of saying that all that money that we're making, that should go to shareholders who matter least. So in the case of Apple, they've done $360 billion in stock buybacks since 2013. The only time Apple in its history ever went to the stock market to get any money was in 1980, and its IPO got $97 million. And yet they call that program plus another $80 billion they've done since 2012 their capital return program. So you got to cut through that ideology. But that actually does mean we're getting innovation, but it's not being shared out the way it should be in the economy as a whole.
Thanks, Bill. That's really great. So our next question is about the current state of the world. So Bill, when you answer this question, it would be great if you could first try and unpack the question. So okay. What do you think about it? Do you think it's even a good question to be asking? I'm sure it is. And so the question that we're asking now is, how can firms innovate themselves to survive in the post-pandemic deglobalizing world?
Okay, well, a lot. So here, it depends what. Okay, the firm is an isolated entity in many ways. I think that's what this question is really saying. Can they do something on their own, or does it have to be a large part of a larger project? I would say it has to be part of a larger project, because even the most powerful firms and anybody who is running General Electric or ExxonMobil or Google or whatever, they're running powerful firms, yet they're often not contributing. They're often part of the problem rather than the solution. They've been innovative at one point, and then they start just doing all this predatory value extraction. So we have to put a stop to it. And we have to actually ensure that the people who are running companies are people who are going to invest in innovation and share the gains of that innovation. So, and it's not going to happen if we just look to them and say, oh, look, that's a good thing to do. It's not going to happen through their voluntarism. They're caught up too much in the constraints of their own ideology and their need to just, let's say, speak to the stock market or their belief in it, whatever. So we have to change that. And the other thing is that it's not the same across all countries. So we can see when we do comparative analysis that different institutional environments that constrain this predatory behavior can make a difference.
Great, thank you, Bill. And our next question is more of a macro question. So it's asking, why does innovation historically take place in fits and starts or innovation bubbles?
Well, that was Schumpeter's question. And I think that what happens is that it does take, you have to put a lot of pieces together. And a lot of what we can see in retrospect was the foundation of innovation is not something that people recognize as innovation when it's happening. So just as one example, even when, the government, U.S. government, largely responsible for developing the internet and then released that for commercial use in 1993 from the National Science Foundation, there were very few people who understood the potential of the internet even people involved in its development for the digital economy we have. Jeff Bezos was one who actually understood that very quickly, and he applied it just first to books and then to a whole lot of other things. But very few people understood where this was going. And even then, you had to put all those pieces in place in order for it to work. You had to have, high-speed internet. You had to have hosts, the kind of computers we have now, et cetera. So a lot of pieces have to be put together. And that was true, of the railroads. It was true of aviation. It was true of a whole lot of things before we actually get to the point where, yes, you can just churn out the products and get the profits of innovation. And often that's when it goes wrong, because the people who control those profits, they then actually control our future as well.
Hi, Bill. That's great. So I've just come across a question that I think actually ties in really nicely with the form of the last three questions. I think it's really interesting, and that is, what should the ultimate goal of a corporation be? I'm sure you've got lots of answers to this question. What should the ultimate goal of a corporation be?
Yeah, it's okay. So that really is the starting point of the theory of innovative enterprise. The purpose of a corporation is to produce a competitive product. And that means it's a product that people want or can or need at a price that they are willing or able to pay. And of course, that's very different if it's a pharmaceutical product versus a cell phone versus some computer app or something, whatever, or just your choice of things that you find in the supermarket. But the high quality part of it is critical, because that is what actually makes it more useful to us. Now, of course, lots of us have different notions of what high quality is. And in some cases, it doesn't matter. In pharmaceutical industry, it does matter. If people thought that opioids, OxyContin was high quality because it got rid of pain, we found out that they had a big problem. People at one thought cigarettes, made you feel whatever, and we now say put on the packages that these can kill you. So that's what drives the economy. Now, if a company is successful in doing that, it has a good chance of making a profit. And I say a good chance, but it's not certain, because it's in nature of innovation that it's uncertain. If we knew how to do something when we started to do something, then it wouldn't be innovation. So we have to understand how that process occurs. We have to understand how to support it. But that's the purpose of the firm. The purpose of the firm is not to make profits. A firm that tries to make profits and doesn't have a competitive product is not going to make profits. So the competitive products are the hard things to do.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask you now, what are the links between the theory of the innovative firm and global capital accumulation trends? Maybe a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, but I think what it really says is we have to look at where the shifts are going in competitive advantage. And actually, that's the way I started my research and my basically academic career. I was I'm not originally from the United States. I had actually, when I came to do a PhD at Harvard in 1970, I had studied in 4 countries in 4 years, in Canada, UK, Switzerland, and then the United States. And I came to the United States because I said, you're not going to understand economics unless you're at the belly of the beast. And it turned out really to be the beast. But at that point, it was far better. We were far better off than we are now in terms of how the corporate economy was running, although there's plenty of critiques. But the thing is, the world has become highly globalized since then. A lot of the things that I've studied, rise of Japanese competition, I've done a lot of work on China, is these changes in industrial leadership. I did historical work on the decline of Britain from being a world leader. And I think what we can see as we look at that is just the importance what I call retain and reinvest, the companies retaining their profits and their people reinvesting And we see this shifts in global leadership, and certainly we see that with the case of China. So one paper that a colleague of mine, Marie Carpenter, and I've been working on forever, and we hope to finish pretty soon, is it has a title, "Why Isn't Cisco Huawei?" Cisco Systems, a leading company in the internet in the United States, should be Huawei, but it's not. Anyway, I'll leave you in suspense on that, but you can ask questions like that. Of course, Huawei is the leading technology company in China that's being banned from the United States and other places, largely for political reasons.
We have a few minutes left, so Bill, I'm going to be a bit selfish and ask you something that I'm interested in, to see if you have any thoughts on that. And I think that the rest of the audience is also probably quite interested to hear on what your thoughts are, in particular on the lessons that we have from the pandemic. So given your research and what you've been looking at, particularly for the past 2 decades, on the tensions between maximizing shareholder value and the innovative firm or innovation within companies, what have we learned, or what does the pandemic tell us about the kind of that theory?
Okay, well, yeah, so the concept that I've been working with in the last number of years, which goes beyond the firm, let's say, is what I call the investment triad. Government agencies, business firms, and household units all need to invest in productive capabilities. So underlying everything here is the need to invest in productive capabilities so that we can confront challenges when they happen. And there's some things that, we invest in that when we need to deal with some kind of crisis, we have the tools to do it in terms of our productive capabilities. But there's other things that we neglect. And clearly, there was a neglect, not so much the organizational side, at least from the United States and other places, of understanding what you need to be prepared for a pandemic, but mobilizing the resources through government business collaborations to be ready to respond productively with all kinds of countermeasures, vaccines to PPE, to the pandemic. And then you can see even where you can respond, of course, you need to have the strategic control in the right place. Hopefully, we're getting a massive shift in strategic control right now. Joe Biden gave his speech this morning on setting up the transition for dealing with the pandemic. And of course, the same applies to being prepared for climate change. We have to make a lot of these investments, and that particularly in the case, we know climate change is, we're bearing the brunt of it already, but who knew that a once in 100-year event like this is not the only a pandemic that's happened in the last 100 years, but something this contagious, this viral would happen in 2020. And so all the investments that needed to be made to avoid this catastrophe basically needed to be made like insurance, hoping that we wouldn't have to use the particular products that we could readily make available when it hit. At the same time, we would have been investing much more in the productive capabilities of people that they could use for useful purposes all along the way in the same firms and different firms, going back and forth between business firms and government agencies. But if everybody is focused on investment in productive capabilities, first of all, everybody would lead much more useful lives. And we would be able to deal, better able to deal in terms of productive capabilities with a crisis like a pandemic.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you for all of your answers to the questions. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for helping us think a bit more about how we can develop these questions further. With that, the first part of this session is a wrap, but the second part is just about to begin. So first, we have to head back to the studio. And I think we're going there now. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Rosie. And thank you, Bill. Your input has raised a ton of great questions. Thank you all for suggesting them into the graph and bringing your thoughts to us. The next part is for us to refine these questions and to consider together which ones do we want to add into the innovation constellation. With that, let's go back to Cecilia.
Hi, everyone, again. This was a very energizing talk, so I'm pretty sure we are all ready to keep working on the questions that we asked Bill and that he started commenting on. So this is the moment when we start working together collaboratively. So if at any point during this part of the session you want to say something, you want to explain why you want to change a question or what you think a question is missing, feel free to do it by just raising your hand with the Zoom option, and we will unmute you so you can present your ideas to all of us. As you can see inside the platform, I've already allowed the new phrasings. The idea of new phrasings is not to suggest new questions, but to try to elaborate a little bit more on the questions that we've already suggested. And we have 4 different questions to work in this next 30 minutes. So I will just go one by one, and remember that if you have a phrasing in mind, you can directly type it in because all the phrasings are allowed. And before we finish, you will also have the chance to select, in case you want to, any of these questions within as one of your 10 favorites. Please do not mistake or the favorites with the likes. The likes are the hearts, and now we will use them to define which is the best phrasing for each of the questions that we will be discussing. So the 4 questions have an original phrasing, and now is the time to try to think a little bit more if there is an alternative phrasing that makes more sense to most of us. So I will go straight to the first question that we have on top here of the panel after Bill's questions, and is how can we explain the mismatch between strong digital innovations and sluggish growth? So just to help you a little bit on this and to give you some of my thoughts in relation to what Bill was bringing to all of us, he was in a way trying to link this question to financial rentership. So there is a question, there is an open question in terms of different types of rents and how they either accumulate or compete with each other on the links or the intertwined relationship between innovation and financialization in contemporary capitalism. So an alternative could be to rephrase this question in the line of financialization, adding or maybe changing it a bit to make it a question that reflects on the links between innovation and financial rentership. And of course, this is only one alternative, but this could work maybe if we want to focus the question on predatory value extraction, as Bill was mentioning. So don't be shy. You can write your phrasings. And once we have different phrasings, we will be able to choose which makes more sense to all of us. We have other 3 questions. So as I said, we will go one by one, but if you have already thought of a phrasing for another question, you can also write that phrasing right away and we will go to it afterwards. Apparently, this question is receiving more likes, the original phrasing. So it may be the case that the original phrasing is the favorite one. However, we've just received another phrasing. So I will read it so that you can all hear it and think about it. How can national and regional innovation systems thrive in post-pandemic deglobalizing world? So this new phrasing actually, because it jumped, the one that I'm sorry, I made a mistake because what actually happened was that this is a rephrasing for another question and the question that received more likes moved. And I was just reading you the new phrasing for the second one. We will go there in a second. Let's keep focusing on the question that now is the second question, actually. I will highlight it so that you all know where we are. We have so many questions that it may take some time for you to actually see where the question is. And that's great because there are many questions being discussed and brought by all the participants. And this is actually what we were looking for. So I'm really happy for that. As I was saying, this question still has no alternative phrasing. It could be just because it's a good phrasing. So I will give you 1-2 more minutes to think about phrasings. But while we do so, we can definitely move to the other question that already has an alternative phrasing. So I will change the highlight so that you know where we are. And there it is. So how can firms innovate themselves to survive in the post-pandemic deglobalizing world? And we have an alternative phrasing for this. The alternative phrasing is, how can national and regional innovation systems thrive in the post-pandemic deglobalizing world? And me, myself, I would like to add something to this question, which is that the question is assuming that we are in a deglobalizing world. And to some extent, this could be the case. It is, and it has been like that since actually the 2008-2009 crisis, in terms of global value chains, in terms of the trade aspect or the tangible goods aspect of globalization. It was flat after the crisis and then started going down. And since the pandemic, with all the lockdowns and so on, it's clear that if we think in terms of tangible products, we are definitely in a kind of deglobalizing world. On the other hand, if we notice the importance of platforms and the digital economy, as the previous question was pointing us to address, we will realize that we are in a more than ever globalized world. What do you think about this YSI plenary? Is definitely based on digital innovations that allowed us to be globalized, but in terms of intangibles. So an alternative phrasing may take into account that we are in a deglobalizing world, maybe in terms of goods, or typically called goods, or tangible products, but not necessarily in terms of intangibles. In terms of intangibles, at least to me, we are in a more globalized world than ever. Here we have another phrasing that avoids this deglobalizing part, and it says, how can firms contribute to society? Which is really interesting, but I think that this phrasing is actually beyond the scope of this question. So maybe we can create a new question from this phrasing, if you agree with me. Which is what I did. So you should see it at some point. Yeah, it's there, but a little bit hide. And as I said before, you can move your likes also. So if you prefer the alternative phrasing that we have so far, that is, how can national and regional innovation systems thrive in the post-pandemic deglobalizing world, you can change your likes. I will also write my own phrasing. Which does not take for granted that we are in a deglobalized world. And I will change my life. If you want, we can also, while you think if you want to change your likes or if you want to keep them as they were in the beginning, we can also move to the next question, the third one. And let me just change the public highlighting so that we are all on the same page. Oh, this one came back in here. And we will discuss the question that says, why does innovation historically take place in fits and starts or innovation bubbles? This actually reminds me something that I don't know if all of you know, but next year it will be the 100-year anniversary of Chris Freeman, which actually worked on this as well, on the long techno-economic waves, as well as Carlota Perez. So I'm pretty sure that you will all have great phrasings for this question, which keeps on being a relevant question. And that it's a question that also drives us to look not only about what's going on today. Many questions are raised, or at least have been raised today in relation to contemporary capitalism. And yes, of course, I can imagine we are all living in an unprecedented time. So it's worth it to think about questions regarding contemporary capitalism. But we should also think about history and the relevance of history. So this is a good question to do that. I will give you some minutes if you want to suggest alternative phrasings, if you want to change your likes. And this question also is related to the time we are in, because there are discussions going on whether we are in a fourth industrial revolution or whether this is in fact the digital economy or the digital transition. It's in fact part of the previous way related to ICT, which I think it is. I think it's a new wave within the ICT revolution, but it's still a matter of discussion. And remember that we still have another question that will be open for rephrasings, which is what are the links between the theory of the innovative firm and global capital accumulation trends? A question that Bill said it was broad, it was ambitious, and that's great because we are looking for ambitious questions actually. Just remember that these are questions that we don't pretend to give a short, quick, and close answer, but actually to make them starting points of projects, of research that we want to conduct together. So I will give you maybe one more second if you want to suggest any alternative phrasing to this question on the innovation bubbles, and we can move to the final question, which is how can we explain the mismatch between strong digital, I know this one comes and goes again, I get it. The last one, as I said, is what are the links, and we have an alternative phrasing here already, what are the links between the theory of the innovative firm, which is one of the main contributions of Bill Lazonick, and a global capital accumulation trends? And the alternative phrasing is, how is the theory of the innovative firm linked to the global capital accumulation trends? So you can feel free to change your likes. Remember that the original phrasing has the incumbent advantage because it was the original one that it was submitted when we didn't have the chance to suggest new phrasings. So all the likes are concentrated in the first phrasing. So if you like the second phrasing more, just change your like by changing your heart. We are now in a tie, so you're all invited to like these either of these phrasings so that we can decide which will be part of the innovation constellation. And eventually, if it receives enough favorites from the community, it may end up being part of the 100 questions that are the most pertinent questions of our time that will be guiding our future projects, research, and all the events that we will be hosting as a community. So apparently the new phrasing is a winner, and we will keep it. I will just read it again so that you all know which one is the one we're keeping. Is how is the theory of the innovative firm linked to the global capital accumulation trends? So now that we've discussed new phrasings and we've also liked the questions, it's time to wrap up by allowing you to favorite questions. As I have just said, the final aim of the YSI Virtual Plenary is to arrive at a set of 100 questions that we collectively believe that are the most pertinent, the most inspiring questions of our time. And to do that, we are all allowed to select 10 favorites from all the constellations, from all the galaxies. And if any of the questions that we discussed today, or maybe also the questions that were suggested by Bill Lazonick, are part of your favorites, you can now click on the star and select them as your favorites. Remember that if you arrive at 10 questions and then you want to change them, that's allowed. So don't be shy. Like the questions, favorite the questions you like most, and eventually you can change them during the course of the plenary as more great talks come and more great discussions take place in this virtual environment. So with this, I will hand it back to studio to finish this incredible talk. Thank you very much for joining. And we still have more amazing sessions inside the question fair today and during the fall week. So let's keep meeting here.
No, that's the other one. Oh, hi, and welcome back to the Lighthouse. So thank you, Cecilia. Now we can see how all the questions that you just discussed in the session has been uploaded into the universe. And yeah, you'll see that right here. That's the entire questions graph. If I move a little bit, then you won't see, so you can see the questions. These are the questions that you just agreed on. The white ones are the questions that you submitted, and the blue ones are Bill Lazonick's questions. And you can see how they're all concentrated over in the innovation constellation. As Cecilia explained in the end of the session, you can now go in, like you can find this whole galaxy of stars and all the constellations on the YSI plenary platform. Each of the stars is a question, and you can go in and help decide the final list of 100 questions by favoriting the ones you like. They will also be shown on your YSI profile. Here, now we can see the latest question in the innovation constellation, and you can see in the top here which one has been favorited the most. And the ones that just came from this session, how can firms innovate themselves to survive in the post-pandemic era, is actually leading. I think this is because this is one of the first sessions. We also have some questions from Mariana Mazzucato earlier today. And as we get towards the end of the plenary, we can use that. You can see that there's a little star on the side. So if you think that these questions are the best and you'd like to include them on your profile, and you think they should have the chance to become on the final list of questions, get in there and favorite them. We only have one more session in the questions fair today. That's going to be in the inequalities constellation with Sanjay Reddy in a few hours. See you then. Thank you.